Shake the Dust was a poem written by an artist who desired to give dignity to people on the margins, the ones who were easily overlooked and whose stories are mostly unaccounted for. It was a poem meant to encourage all of us to embrace the stories we've lived. It was a poem meant to encourage all of us to embrace the stories we've lived and to make better sense of the worlds inside and outside of ourselves. When I heard it, I fell in love with poetry for the very first time. And the poet responsible for this piece of art, whose work sings just as beautifully on the page as it does on the stage, is Anis Mojgani. He's probably my favorite poet in the world. Not only is Anis a two-time National Poetry Slam champion, winner of the International World Cup Poetry Slam, and a multiple-time TEDx speaker, he's also an Iranian American originally from New Orleans with a passion for processing the human interior. He gets the tension of holding both resilience and inclusivity in the words that we say and the art that we choose to bring into the world. Anis is an awesome new friend of mine and a fellow accomplice in seeing the world for what it truly is. An opportunity to hold tremendous grief and tremendous joy at the same time, inviting both to have a seat at the table while trying to make a sense of the mess. I am Branden Harvey, and this is Sounds Good, the weekly podcast where we have conversations with inspiring people who are rejecting cynicism and using their lives to make an impact. I'm pumped about this conversation, but before we get started, I want to make sure that you stick around for the ending of this episode to hear Anis perform one of his most inspirational pieces of poetry. It was the poem that hooked me on Anis, and you're not going to want to miss it. Okay, with all that being said, let's just jump straight into the conversation. Here we go. So I was trying to figure out how I first came across your work or even your name. And I was processing through that for myself. And what I would imagine is many people, the very first time that I encountered your work, your poetry, was through To Write Love on Our Arms. You performed at Heavy and Light, which is a big annual event they do. And you performed one of the poems that I would imagine is the most iconic, Shake the Dust.
Yeah.
And from that moment, I had a deep connection with poetry. I was like, wow, this is amazing. And so I'm just honored that I'm getting to talk with you today. This is so fun.
Well, thank you.
You and I just went across the street and got some Pips donuts.
Got some Pips donuts.
These are delicious.
They are. They, yeah. More just, and I don't know how much longer you're in town, but if you have the opportunity and you haven't yet, gotten a donut from Rocking Frog Cafe.
Rocking Frog. I've never heard of this, and I'm a donut professional.
It's a tiny cafe, like, over on Belmont, and I don't know if I should be. You know, on one level, you're sort of like, you don't want, like, the things that, like, are throwback to yesteryears of changing cities to, like, get caught up in the change, but then you're also like, but you also don't want them to go away, so you, like, want people to, like, throw their money at them. But, like, at the end of the day, like, folks that make kick-ass donuts people should know that they make kick-ass donuts. And, Rocking Frog, like, it's kind of in the similar manner of Pips in that it's just sort of, like, simple donuts. Takes, like, 5-10 minutes because they go back and they make it right then and there.
Wow.
Toss it in the fryer, it comes out. And they just have, like, 4 or 5 simple ones. And it's so freaking good. It's my favorite donut in Portland. Like,
that's great.
Yeah, it used to just be, like, this little stand called Moody's at the back of Rocking Frog. And we used to go there, like, a few times 10 years ago or so, and then Moody's closed, and then when I returned to Portland, I was like, somehow it came onto my radar that, like, Rocking Frog had taken to just making these donuts. I was like, oh my God,
man,
they're so close to my house. Yes!
That's so good.
So you get the chance.
Good.
Rocking Frog.
I'll do it. We were talking about this before we started recording, but you've been in Portland for 2 years now, but before that you were in town for how long?
I first came to Portland not with the intention to, like, stay longer than maybe a few months. But I first moved here in 2004. Got here Halloween Day, 2004, and lived here that first stint until January of 2011.
Great.
Down in Austin, spent 5 years there, came back here coming up on 2 years ago.
Man, okay, so same city, but we totally missed each other. We were in the same city at different times.
Yeah.
But I first found out about your work through not the same city, but through To Write Love in Our Arms and the fine folks there, and Jamie Twerkowski, and I saw you perform via the internet at Heavy and Light. How did you first get connected to the fine folks at To Write Love in Our Arms?
If I recall correctly, Jamie sent me a message on MySpace.
Oh, that is the best. I was probably friends with you back on the MySpace days.
This was, he had sent me a message. I think it was like, because let's see, the first Heavy and Light that I did was, I think it was 2010. Because I feel I have a memory of having a visit down in Austin. So I wasn't yet living there, and I had seen his message. So like he dropped me a line like 2009, 2010 about I have this organization, To Write Love in Our Arms, and it didn't I wasn't familiar with the organization. And sometimes I get random emails from random folks of varying degrees of like, some things are very intentional, like, hey, here's this thing that I'm doing. I'd love to talk to you about participating. And sometimes it's just sort of like, hey, here's this thing I'm doing. It'd be great if and it's just sort of like just some guy like, in his house, And so it didn't really like stay on my to-do list to kind of like get back to him. And he probably wrote me again, and I was like, oh, what is this thing? And like I said, I wasn't familiar with To Write Love in Our Arms, but it jumped out to me as something that was in line with things that I try to align myself with, and was curious about it, and it seemed like an interesting experience. It was a paying gig, and so like I went to that first one and got introduced to a community of people that I remember at that time feeling like, oh, here's like some people and like an audience of people that are all kind of like tapped into not the exact same stuff, but kind of like a similar direction that felt very similar to the community of poets and artists that I had aligned with.
How would you describe that direction?
One that was like seeking to, if not necessarily change the world, assist and help and change people's mindsets inside that world. Allowing folks to mess up, allowing folks to hurt, allowing folks to look at their pain and their troubles and their challenges and not hide from them, not be blinded by them, but nor not to be hindered by them. And in the poetry world, within the slam of like spoken word and poetry slams, like anything, there's varying degrees of like why people do contribute to like whatever form of creativity and community they align themselves with. But it was something that like the folks that I was friends with and had rallied myself with within slam and spoken word were people that were of that ilk, people that were writing and creating work that spoke to their hearts, both on the days when like their hearts are bruised or broken or shattered, and also speaking to the days in which like those hearts are large and powerful and moving through those cracks. And then taking that, what you've created for yourself and like sharing it with others so that they don't feel alone in all that. And that was something that felt very similar from my experience To Write Love in Our Arms, that it was like, oh, here's these people that are like working to do that. And here's this room full of people that like, I don't know who the hell any of these people are. I assure you, no one in this room knows who I am. I think there's maybe like one or two people. I remember when I came on stage, there was like a couple of folks where it was like these woos that was like, that's a woo from somebody that like knows me. So it was like, maybe there was like one person in this room of 1,000. And so that was also exciting to get to kind of like, share work with people that were not necessarily familiar with me, not necessarily familiar with my work, and getting to like share that with them. And just icing that, it was like, sharing it with people that seemed to be in similar places that my community and my audience outside of To Write Love in Our Arms was aligned with. So and it was also pretty cool to just kind of like, oh, this is a music show. All right, This is something different for me.
But you opened up the show, right?
Yeah,
you were the first one out on stage.
On that night, I can't remember how the first one went, because I know like there was some where I did stuff like throughout. Like I did something at the start and then like something in the middle and sometimes the end. But it was definitely like, this element of, usually I do a show, particularly at that time.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's all poets. And it was like, I'll be sharing the stage with like 6 or 7 musical acts. And then somewhere in there is like some poetry. And so it's like, here's a bunch of people in the audience that might be like, poetry, what's going on? But it was rad.
I mean, the very first poem that I ever heard from you, which I believe you performed at this event we're talking about, was Shake the Dust, which is this one of your most biggest name pieces?
Yeah, I would say that it is.
And what I love about it is that it speaks to this idea of inclusivity and resilience. Does that sound accurate?
It does.
And I think that this community of To Write Love in Our Arms, which is really a community of people who are rallying together in the midst of mental illness and anxiety and depression and so many other things, and standing up for people who feel silent, I think it's a really beautiful poem that,
well, thank you.
has the power to connect people. I feel like that is actually a theme that seems to be pretty common among a lot of your work, is inclusivity and resilience. Is that an intentional choice to create these things that when you're listening to it, when you're hearing it, when you're reading it, it makes your heart kind of pump knowing that you feel a sense of connection with this thing? Is that an intentional choice, or is that just something that's coming from you?
I think it's a mix of both. Directly speaking, to say just like my creative process is not one that necessarily I think, all right, I'm going to write something about this today, and I sit down and write. Like, anytime I try to do that, those are the pieces that usually don't get finished.
Yeah, interesting.
Like for me, the creative process is why I enjoy it and it calls to me is because it gives me the opportunity to have a direction to walk in, but not necessarily knowing if I'm going to stay in that direction or what I'm going to find at the end of that. It gives me the opportunity to learn about whatever's going on inside of me. It gives me the opportunity to explore those spaces, to discover new things that I might like, things that I might not like, and so having like a clear-cut decision like, oh, I'm going to write about this thing, about this topic, always proves very difficult and challenging for me. But an element of kind of like creating a space, I think, that allows for whatever is sitting in me to find its way out. And I think and believe that I'm a person that those things are very, very important to me. Specifically speaking to say like inclusivity and resilience. I come from a place of being raised that speaks to that and allows for that. And that was always very important to me. And I think, any of the good things in me come from that. I've said to folks in the past, like the religion that my parents raised me and my siblings in, the Baha'i faith, one of the things that traveled with me through and continues to travel with me, like, through my life is this idea that humans are created inherently noble. And for me, that rests inside of me always. And, so depending on like where my headspace is, where my heart space is on any given time when I'm going to write, that may take the reins more forcefully. It may not. That is definitely like the place where my heart sits. That's the river that it sits inside of. That idea. That's the foundation. Very often work that I am creating will always return to that. Even work that may not necessarily be that like obvious, or work that is like that apparent on the surface, like simply the act of me and others, simply the act of saying like, all right, I created this thing that at times is very personal, speaks very highly to my own individual vulnerability, to my awesomeness, to my sorrow, to my tininess, all those things, whatever I might be writing as I process a myriad of different stuff, after creating it and sharing it to somebody else, that act in itself, I think, is something that says, like, I feel these things because I'm human. And, like, chances are you feel all these things at some point because you are human. And maybe and you recognize that. But maybe you don't, because unfortunately a lot of us, have been given a path in this life that doesn't allow us to spend time with ourselves, that doesn't allow us to spend time with the things that are difficult about being a person. So, I think of the art that has spoken to me over my life, and very often that was art that reminded me that, like, oh, there are other humans in this world, and there are other humans that feel things similar to how I feel, both on my high days and my low days. And so, that act of engaging with artwork that simply, like, speaks honestly to that is something that in itself will always, I think, allow for inclusivity and resilience.
That's a really beautiful way of putting that, and it does.
Very long way of putting
No,
it.
I love that. I was engaged, but it reminds me of this idea of we connect far more with each other's weaknesses or imperfections than our strengths and our successes.
Yeah.
And I think what you do and what poetry at its core is it is zooming in on these depths within us and then putting pictures and imagery to these ideas. And of course, yeah, like why wouldn't that be connective? Because that's something that is embedded in all of us.
Yeah.
We were talking about this before the podcast started, but there's nobody that like there's nobody that's like every day is awesome. You know, even though that Lego Movie song "Everything Is Awesome" is fantastic, and I love Chris Pratt. Like the reality is, none of us are like, yeah, this is like everything in life is great, and that's what this podcast was. I thought it was going to be in the beginning, is just like this, like, oh, let's just have conversations with all the people whose lives are awesome. And the people whose lives are awesome on the outside, oftentimes that comes from a place of learned resilience because of the difficult things that have happened in their lives.
Well, with Shake the Dust, it's folks will have sometimes asked me, like, do you get tired of performing? How many times have you performed? Like I turned 40. It's a poem that I wrote when I was 22. 23.
Wow.
I wouldn't write that poem in that form at this juncture in my life. Just like I have a different relationship with my writing and my aesthetic as an artist and those things. But, I still have a desire and a calling to like share this piece, because similar to what you were saying, that like no one goes through their whole life without, like some things you learn and you like carry them. And it's like, oh, this is always the case. Like I learned how to do this thing. Boom. I don't have to like learn this thing again. But like we always have to learn how important we are.
Yeah.
There are days when I feel like amazing and unbelievable. And I like know the vastness of like my incredible being, and just like there are the days when I'm like, am insignificant and I am unimportant. And not that those necessarily are like bad things, but like inside of that, I am also tiny and worthless and fucking up and pathetic and pitiful. And, and it's like we all engage with that, And so it's like there's not a shelf life for me, to say this poem of Shake the Dust, that it's not like, oh, I wrote it and so like now I'm good to go.
Yeah.
I wrote it and anyone who hears it is now good to go. It's like we all need those reminders. We all need, that pickup. We all need that thing that says like, yeah, like today maybe my heart is a little dull, but I need something that reminds me that there were those days when it wasn't dull, just like there are going to be days when it's not dull. And just because it's dull today, that dullness doesn't define like what it actually is. So it's not something that like, it doesn't have a shelf life. It's something that you constantly have to be reminded of.
How did you get into poetry in the first place?
The first place was I took a creative writing class my last year of high school. I had always engaged with visual arts prior to that and was heading off the
Where did you go to
year.
school? Or where did you grow up? Sorry.
Grew up in New Orleans and went to Benjamin Franklin High School. It was I graduated there in 95. And the following year, I was going to be going off to art school. So, like, art was definitely something that was very present in my life. And my last year of high school, I had space on my schedule. So, like, I took a bunch of classes. mostly art related, and one of them was creative writing. And there was a poetry component to that. And it just sort of kind of like opened up a gate into like another field that I didn't know was like next to and connected to the field that I'd primarily been roaming in with drawing and painting. And it was like, oh, here's this whole other thing to explore in the same landscape, but that's also different and new.
Yeah.
And it spoke to me. And the next year, gone off to school in Savannah, Georgia, and I took a poetry class sometime that year, and it definitely kind of like anchored it down that this was something that was important to me to engage in on a consistent basis, both as like a creative exploration, but also as a way of just processing my interior. And got introduced to the existence of spoken word and poetry slams, and didn't get to necessarily like participate with those, at least not the slams, but it was something that kind of like my introduction to those like sparked something in me that was like, oh, I really want to see what it's like to share work out loud, out of my mouth to ears, and I want to write work, that I then can do that, and I'm curious about that, and so that was like around the same time as well.
Okay, so a minute ago you talked about this idea of like we don't all have the opportunity to process our feelings or our emotions or the things going on in our brains, and you've been fortunate enough to do that. And it sounds like even before the world of poetry, you were involved in art. What in your life growing up allowed you to have that space to be able to pursue those things? Because I feel like, I mean, in some ways it's like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing, where it's like you can reach a point of like self-actualization and that kind of thing to be able to process these things. But the other part is, having people in your life who are encouraging you and supporting you in pursuing the arts rather than, encouraging you to do, any other thing.
Yeah.
What was that support system like for you then?
I mean, like, I'm super, super grateful for the place that I come from. And it's definitely like a privilege, to have grown up in a space, in a household with parents that, neither of them are artists, so to speak. I think like there's different, at different times in their life, they've definitely had a relationship with their creativity that was allowed or not allowed to manifest itself, perhaps like as much as they may have wanted. I don't know. My pops is, he's a civil engineer, and he's from Iran. And like the joke is that like, if you're Persian, you basically can only become an engineer, a doctor, or a lawyer. So it's like it's not like a culture that's like screw the arts, but it's just like it's not something that and by and large, like most cultures are not ones that are like, make art.
Well,
just step into that. Like that. That's the place where like my pops was. So like any artistic inclinations that he had, which from over the years, I gather were present. It was not something that to like seriously invest in. And my mom has always done stuff with books. She had a children's bookstore when we were growing up, and then has been a librarian at different levels of education, like ever since she left the shop. And but they both, especially my mom, I think, were very supportive of ensuring that me and my siblings had creative outlets and had art in our lives. Whether that was like trips to the museum, whether that was taking a pottery class, like that it was something that was not something to be kind of like turned away, but like, Anis has a desire to draw, that like that's not something to like stop doing that. Like, why are you doing that? Why are you wasting your time? It's time to put that away and do this other thing.
What an encouragement to have people who recognize that and then support it.
And so there was always support with that.
That's great.
And there was never, not one conversation that I ever had with them, when I decided I want to go to this small art school in Georgia to study comic books. There was never a conversation that was like, are you sure this is what you want to do? Do you want to consider this? What are you going to do once you're done with school? Like none of that was was the thing. You know, I mean, like I remember when I was, for most of my childhood, I wanted to be an architect. And like I was just consumed with architecture. And then when I was like 12 or so, my mom had read this article about SCAD, this art school in Georgia. And she was like, oh, I read about this like pretty interesting sounding like art college in Georgia. Maybe that's something you'd like to explore. I was like, no.
I love the Anis mom voice in this situation, by the way.
And I was just like, I don't want to be an artist. I'm going to be an architect and design buildings and cities and stuff, you know, and like, you know, so it was like something that had been offered and given to me in this manner that was before even like I really had truly, I think, considered and invested that, you know, and then, you know, 5 years after that, that ends up being the only school that I applied to and go to, you know, like, they were always super, super supportive of, you know, I mean, like, my sister studied public health. You know, her undergrad is in near Middle Eastern languages and anthropology. My brother, his degrees are in theater. You know, I mean, like, you know, it was never anything that was like, you need to be making serious consideration decisions about your life. You know, it was always like, more than just the art aspect that it was. I feel like I'm talking a lot. I apologize.
No, I mean, you know that your name is on the title of this podcast.
I'm just going to talk for 60 minutes straight and then take this headset off.
I mean, I'm not opposed. Sounds great to me.
But like more than just like the art aspect, like I've spoken and talked about this in prior, but like that my parents, whether they did this with a plan or conscientiously or just were like, that's just how it happened from like their parenting styles from being individuals. Like, how do you raise a kid? I don't know. But that like, you know, it was a household that allowed us to be comfortable being ourselves. And there was like plenty of times as a kid that I was not comfortable being myself. Like, you know, it's definitely like weird. You don't even have the tools to process, I think, you know, when you're 8 and like, you know, your pops is Persian, but you don't really know what that means. And you know your mom is black, but you don't really know what that means. So you definitely don't know what it means to be like both those things. And that like, you know, you don't seem to act like your Iranian cousins and you don't speak Farsi. And you definitely don't look like any of the black kids in your neighborhood. And you don't, like, see the black side of your family very often, if ever. And so it's like you just kind of, like, grow up in this place where you're not quite sure what you're not sure about, you know? I was like a tiny, tiny child, just a weird kid. Like, all kids are weird, you know, like spending time in your imagination. You know, and I was, like, pretty loud and outgoing, but then also very, very bashful. You know, so there's a lot of space where you're not sure about yourself, and a lot of times, and most days where you like feel more awkward than less awkward, but you also, you know, are in a household where that's not necessarily like a thing to concern yourself with. So, you know, definitely was given the space to just like, you do you, and you figure that out.
Do you feel like you were in the middle of a lot of cultures then? Because you're in the South, you're in Louisiana, which is, you know, definitely an experience of its own. You're probably also still surrounded by white folks in some respect, but then you've got this Iranian side of things and then the black side of things. Was there a time where you kind of transitioned over into trying to be more aware of what that meant for you and kind of what that experience was like? Or was it just something where you were given this gift your whole life of, you know, not needing to figure it out in your home, so you got to transit? I don't know. What does that look like?
It was like different things. You know, definitely was like, you know, growing up, I didn't necessarily feel Iranian, but I definitely didn't feel black. You know, that felt like a very foreign entity almost to me. You know, I mean, and it's like, you know, I walk down the street, I engage with a conversation with somebody who knows me, like, yeah, you see that black guy that just walked by? You know, like, that's not going to register with anyone. And the neighborhood that we lived in was primarily black, but like most of my friends from school were probably white. It was a pretty diverse and mixed school, But then we also had, separate from that was like the Baha'i community. And the Baha'i community was one that was like very, very diverse. It was like a lot of adults, a lot of kids, white folks, Persian folks, black folks, just like folks with families, grown people that were like partnerless, just like a pretty diverse thing to like grow up inside.
Yeah.
And it was also like removed from the other components of one's world, where it's like you've got like your life and then all of a sudden like you go to this Baha'i thing and there's all these people and they're all, it's like, I remember going to in 6th grade, my best friend was this guy, Peter Becker. And I'd go over to his house and hang out with Peter and his younger brother, Christian. And their mom's name was Penny. I always called her Penny. Growing up, I never called any adult Mr. or Mrs. Blank. And it wasn't like a disrespectful thing, but like that's just not how I was raised.
Totally.
Because in the Baha'i community, it was like all the adults, we called them by their first name.
Yeah, a deeper connection.
Yeah. And so there was diversity of age as well. And so there was like this like world where it was kind of like, not so much that it was like colorblind or anything, but that it was the Baha'i faith sits on tenets of unity. And so the beliefs of one human race and that there's unity in diversity, that women and men are created equal. All these things like, were given to me as a child and you just sort of like absorb them. It's like, oh, okay, that's how it is. But you're also not, that's not the reality of the world. And so you don't even necessarily, I think, as a child know that there's something to process, which is like,
oh yeah,
that
makes sense
because it is something to process. I think particularly like as a mixed race kid growing up in New Orleans, New Orleans being a really mixed place that's also situated in the South and is also it's very different than a lot of the South, but it's also very Southern. So I don't know, like all the stuff with kind of like race and where I came from was something that was removed from me. It was almost sort of like this thing that was kind of like in this ball that was spinning outside of my body. And that it was like I didn't know that it was really traveling with me. And then at some point there was certain, I remember trying to figure elements of that out. I remember in middle school, I guess I was like 13 or so. I guess I'd gotten a gift from somebody. I feel it was somebody maybe like in the Baha'i community who was black had like given me like a Malcolm X hat. There was like a period in the in the late 80s where like Malcolm X got really, really big. Like all these like Malcolm X hats, Malcolm X shirts. And I remember like pumped about this hat, but I also felt weird wearing it. Like I didn't know if I was like supposed to or allowed to, but I couldn't really figure out like why I felt that way, I think. And then when I was probably like 19, 20. Like sometime in the midst of my college years, I found myself at a place where I felt really, really low. I was struggling a lot with, you're transitioning into being more of an adult and less of the person I think that you have been raised as. And I it's not like I was like doing all this crazy stuff. It's not like I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna like slut it up and like snort cocaine and like rob people, like I wasn't doing anything, but there was like this element in my head that was like, I'm effing up, like I don't feel like I'm as good as this faith, this religion is that I was raised in. That I practiced, that I believed in, that it wasn't this. I was like, this thing is good, so everyone associated it must be good. And I don't know if, I feel human, was essentially what it was. Didn't realize that that's what it was, but it's like I feel bad, and I must be the only one because everyone else must be good because like they're part of this like really good thing, and I went to this thing in Maine, one of the Baha'is in Savannah, Georgia, black gentleman, this older brother named Michael O'Neill. There was this thing that was happening in Maine and started happening called the Black Men's Gathering, which essentially was men of African descent, either Baha'is or connected to the faith in some way, would congregate for a week in the blackest place in America, Maine, and for a week of like
Lobster rolls.
Exactly. We'd just go there for the lobster rolls. We'd hang out and we'd pray and we'd sing and we'd talk trash and play spades and eat and heal and learn and figure out how to be so that we could best and better serve our communities back home as black men. And Michael's like, you got to come to this. You got to come. And so finally I was able to go and I went, and that was a really big thing for me. I think a lot of the stuff that I was going through was stuff that was connected to just not being certain or sure, like what I am or what I was or what could I claim or what was claiming me. And it really started opening up the doors to allow me to, find my way into what it means to be an Iranian American and what it means to be an African American. And, and that's a process that like is still malleable and organic and like changes. And, like some of the stuff I alluded to earlier, like it's not something where it's like every day I'm like, yeah, I'm completely comfortable, and it's not even being like of African descent in a body that like, looks like some ambiguously Eastern Asian, maybe like Hispanic dude, it is still a process.
Were you using poetry as a mechanism to dive into this and to deconstruct this?
A little bit, not a whole. I mean, like I definitely like wrote poems that like spoke to that. It's a thing that I've never felt like I've really fully been able to like crack open. What are the things that I want and desire and need to write to regarding race and my heritage. There's things that surface up. There's things that bubble up and come out onto the page. And particularly, like, it's been a lot more present in my writing, or at least my inclination in my writing over the past few years, just like, largely due to the current state of this country and the more vocal dialogues that have been happening in this country. But yeah, it was present, but it wasn't like really huge.
Yeah,
there was definitely like I think a lot of the poems that usually would come out were written speaking and addressing the conundrum, the question, the thing that I was experiencing as being like, what does it mean to hold two races in one set of hands?
And that idea of diving into the question is almost more interesting than the answer, because you can't give somebody the answer.
I can't give somebody an answer, but like it was definitely like at that time it was more about what does it mean for me to be mixed, to be biracial. And I think more the thing that I'm interested in writing these days with regards to race is just simply like, what does it mean to be black in America? What does it mean to be Iranian America? And not that it's not like, of course, my lens of that is going to be through this lens of how those two things merge in me. But like, before it was like, how do I deal with this idea of like having two heritages in me? And more now it's like, how do I deal with being the heritages that I am, particularly in this country?
Wow. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm coming at this from, a straight up white dude perspective. But it seems like that's something that we can all be kind of asking ourselves is like, my experience as, historic identity, my racial identity, my whatever identity, how does this resonate in the time we live in today?
Yeah.
And I think that by asking those questions, and those have certainly been things I've been asking myself, it allows you to actually do something with that. And it's tricky. You and I were talking as we were eating donuts right before this about politics. And so much of your work is hopeful, but you also live in this dichotomous time of like 2017 being a difficult time to be a person of color in general, a person of, Middle Eastern Persian descent, black, the whole,
as I say in one of my poems, I say, there's a line where I say like, I'm born to an Iranian man and a black woman. So like born under two bad signs, like to be black in America and to be Middle Eastern America these days is like, all right, I won the lottery, it definitely behooves everyone to step to the table of themselves, and particularly in this country, because like This country is rooted in, I mean, like, it's rooted in a wealth of, like, atrocities that we do not speak of, you know, and we do not grow from. I mean, like, last week I was in, as I was saying to you, I was in Eastern Oregon for this thing called Fish Trap. And Fish Trap is rooted in the West and writing of the West. And it takes place on Nez Perce tribal lands. And so there's a lot, particularly this year, there's a lot of conversation and dialogue about the Native community in this country as a whole. And so, like, by no means is like singularly like the plight of the black person in America, like the only like ridiculousness of this country's past. But like, we need to, like, as I said, like, sit at the table of ourselves and figure out what it is that, like, who we are, both with regards to, like, our racial identity and our heritage, and what is that relationship to America? You know, I mean, like, Baldwin says something about, like, the destiny of the whites and blacks in this country are intricately intertwined. This is something that cannot be, like, figured out and rectified. You know, the plights of people of color.
Yeah, we're all bound together.
The struggles of people of color, the struggles of Native Americans, you know, like all those things cannot be, like, unlocked without, you know, white folks coming to the table as well to figure shit out.
I feel like so much of your work has this deep sense of hope within it. And I haven't heard as much of your work, or maybe any of your work, from 2017, your most recent stuff, you know, whatever you're working on these days. But judging by past experience, I would imagine there's still a sense of hope. Where do you find hope in the midst of that struggle and within the midst of that, you know, ambitious plan for the future?
It's both very easy to do such, and it's also extremely difficult. You know, I mean, like, these days are really hard. It's terrifying, the days that we live in, from a multitude of onslaughts. And, you know, I mean, like, I remember after Election Day, like, I didn't get out of bed until, like, 1 in the afternoon. You know, I usually get out of bed at, like, 8 a.m. You know, I would just lay in bed till, like, 1 in the afternoon for, like, I don't know, a month, 2 months. You know, my therapist, I was talking to my therapist at that time, and she was like, "Are you depressed?" I was like, "Well, yeah." You know, I mean, it's like, you're reminded every day that, like, we live in a country that is fucking crazy and just seeks to gaslight every person that lives inside of it to make us feel that we're the crazy ones. And the people that we literally hire to, like, run it aren't running it. You know what I mean? Like, this, I pulled up the news today, and it's like, Republicans seeking again to, like, figure out this healthcare thing. It's like, yo, man, like, y'all spent Obama's entire presidency fighting this thing, and, like, now you've spent, like, the last 6 months fighting this thing that no one wants you to fight against. They want you to, like, make better, you know? And every time you, like, fail at, like, your intent to get rid of it, as opposed to being like, all right, well, maybe we should learn from this and, like, see what we can do to progress towards, like, hold on, guys, we're coming back in a couple weeks to see if we can't fuck you up, you know? Like, and so it's like every day there's just, like, this onslaught of stuff. Everything's horrible. But that's the thing. It's like we all know everything's horrible, you know? And so it's like it can be really difficult, but I also don't know how to not – I don't even know if, like, hopeful is the word, but I don't know how to, like, move through my life in a manner that keeps me laying in the mud. You know, like, I've had parts of my life where that has been the case, and it isn't good.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't give me anything. It doesn't give others anything. And it's fine to lay in the mud. You know, like, it's not like every day I'm like, oh, it feels kind of bad. That's all right. I'm hopeful. You know, it's like, things are bad. That's all right. You know, I'll make a positive spin on this. You know, it's like, because that's the thing. I don't feel like I engage with the world that's, like, trying to put a positive spin. I hesitate to, like, try to seek to find silver lining and stuff. Like, you know, I think, like, a lot of the way in which our society shapes us is to kind of, like, have it be this either or thing. You know, that, like, when you're feeling low, you're not supposed to feel low. You're supposed to feel good. So you got to do what you can to feel good. You got to try to find the good in all the bad stuffs around you. And to me, that doesn't work. That's a lie. What works is to recognize like, oh, I have tremendous sadness and anger and grief inside of me. But that doesn't mean that I also don't have in the same hand tremendous joy and like a wealth of laughter to engage with. And so much goodness in me and so much goodness in the people that my life bumps it up against. And all those things can exist, and they're all sitting there. You know, it's not like, and there's sometimes where like one of them maybe like bubbles up a little bit more to the top, but that doesn't mean that there's still not another one sitting there. You know, and you know, it works the same way. You know that like, you know, I got this joy, but like, it doesn't behoove me to ignore that like there's still sadness and sorrow sitting there as well. But for me, the way that I think I am able to maintain that hope, you know, that it is rooted in kind of like carrying these things together. And like at my heart, there's been a wealth of like things that constantly try to prove different to me, but I do believe in the beauty of what it means to be a human. I think we go about it wrongly often, particularly these days. We make it more difficult than it needs to be, but that there is a beauty to being, not even just to being strictly human, but there's a beauty to getting to be a human in the world that we are humans inside of, that we are part of this thing. And the times and the ways in which humanity aligns itself in the spots and places that it fits in sync with how like the world moves with it. You know, that's what I find a really beautiful thing. And so it's like I want that. You know, I reach towards that. You know, it's like, yeah, I mean, there's just like awesome stuff. Can we not just have awesome stuff and make it happen? You know, like
it's really fascinating to think about holding all of these things in our hands. And it just reminds me of so many people I've gotten to have conversations with over the last few years who have this great capacity for joy, but it only comes from a place of having a great capacity for pain. That's why I don't think that people should be spinning, you know, the negative things that happen in their lives into something positive. Yeah. Because then you lose the ability to hold both those things at once. I heard somebody once call it brutal, where it's, you know, it's beauty and it's brutal.
Yeah.
And you're holding them both at once. I don't know if I can even go as far to say that like, that's a beautiful experience to have, that it's like an important experience to have, because it's in the midst of that, it never feels good.
Yeah.
But it gives you a more deep human experience. And coming back to the poetry side of things, I think that poets have always had this unique ability to call that out, to call out the human experience and celebrate it, whether it's good, whether it's bad, you know, perceived good or perceived bad, and provide imagery for it so that we don't forget about the experience, so that we're reminded of it when we see the things going on in the world.
Definitely.
For people who are drawn to this conversation and they feel that they want to experience life more fully, they want to experience, you know, all of these things in one hand, they want to do that and they don't want to run from these ideas, or they don't want to just veer towards one or the other in the way that you do as a poet. What kind of advice would you give them?
Oh man, these days I feel almost like a charlatan that like, I don't know how to give advice like that, or untainted thoughts. You know, it's like there was this really beautiful book of poetry I read last week from Catherine Sullivan. She's a poet here in Portland, and she started the press Yes Yes Books, and it's just a really beautiful, beautiful book of poetry. And the thing that's so beautiful about it is that like it's filled with all these like very just all the things in her life, and just like the day-to-day real world situations that she experiences with her family and those challenges and tribulations. And, you know, there was like one poem that's in the book. I can't remember everything in it, but like there's this part where she's talking about like, oh, how she would love to like be able to just kind of like sit and write about like the wonder of this or the wonder of that as a poet. But like she's got to deal with this and this and this and all these things like of a household that like some are very large challenges and some are like small challenges, but still like part of this like household. And like, I feel like I'm in the first part of that these days, you know, that it's like, I get up, I like bike to the coffee shop, I sit there, I just stare out the window, watch the kids walk by, watch the people come in and sell books, drink some coffee, write something, get on my bike, go eat. It's like this weird, blissful, non-existing existence, that of course like allows me to like be present and observe, like because it's like I don't have all this other stuff that's saying like that's vying for my attention. And so that's all to say that like the best way to do it is just become a full-time poet like me, but I think that it's important to fight to find time for oneself amongst all this. And I know that is a challenge, but it also doesn't have to be like a lot of time for oneself. And it doesn't have to be important time for oneself. Like time with oneself is not wasted. It's not like, like I had this hour where I didn't have to do anything. I had these 15 minutes where I didn't have to do anything. And I spent it without like coming to any revelation. I spent it without solving anything. I did it without like, I spent it like not making anything, like that's not necessarily the task at hand, when you engage with your interior, like it's important to just sort of like allow what may happen to unfold, is one thing, That being said, I think it's also important for us to fight to stay engaged with other humans, like we do not live in a vacuum. We do not live on an island of one. That's, I think, always the forever human conundrum, that like as a human will always be completely alone. And you as a human will always be never alone. It's like both those things are existing in your life at the same time.
Holding them both in your hand.
Yeah. And you got to fight for both of those. You got to fight to stay engaged with those around you, and you got to fight for your space for yourself, so that you're not afraid to be by yourself. You're not afraid to be alone. If you can like spend that time in the company of yourself, then like you don't have to be afraid of what unfolds with that. You don't have to be afraid of the sadness that comes, the grief that comes, the anger that comes. None of those things are bad things. They simply allow us to like look at the world in a more successful manner.
Oh man, that was such a good conversation. I love how Anis sees the world, and I feel like I learned so much from spending that time with him and ultimately eating donuts with him. But before we wrap everything up, we are going to hear Anis's live performance of his amazing poem, Shake the Dust. It's from Heavy and Light, an event put on by a wonderful nonprofit. I love them. To Write Love in Her Arms. It's such a good performance. Here we go. Anis Mojgani, Shake the Dust.
And this one right here, this is for the fat girls. This one is for the little brothers. This is for the schoolyard wimps and for the childhood bullies that tormented them. For the former prom queen and for the milk crate ball players. For the nighttime cereal eaters and for the retired elderly Walmart store front door greeters. Shake the dust. This is for the benches and the people sitting upon them. For the bus drivers driving 1,000,000 broken hymns. For the men who have to hold down 3 jobs simply to hold up their children. For the nighttime schoolers and for the midnight bike riders trying to fly. Shake the dust. This is for the 2-year-olds who cannot be understood because they speak half English and half God. Shake the dust. For the boys with the beautiful, beautiful sisters. Shake the dust. For the girls with those brothers who are going crazy. Those gym class wallflowers. And the 12-year-olds afraid of taking public showers. For the kid who's always late to class because he forgets the combination to his lockers. For the girl who loves somebody else. Shake the dust. This is for the hard men who want love but know that it won't come. For the ones the amendments do not stand up for. For the ones who are forgotten. For the ones who are told to speak only when you are spoken to. and then never spoken to. Speak every time you stand so you do not forget yourself. Do not let one moment go by that doesn't remind you that your heart beats 100,000 times a day and that there are enough gallons of blood to make every one of you oceans. Do not settle for letting these waves settle and for the dust to collect in your veins. This is for the celibate pedophile who keeps on struggling, for the poetry teachers and for the people who go on vacations alone, for the sweat that drips off of Mick Jagger's singing lips and for the shaking skirt on Tina Turner's shaking hips, for the heavens and for the hells through which Tina has lived. This is for the tired and for the dreamers. For those families that will never be like the Cleavers with perfectly made dinners and sons like Wally and the Beaver. This is for the bigots, for the sexists, for the killers, and for the big house jail sentenced cats becoming redeemers. And for the springtime that somehow seems to always show up after every single winter. This is for you. This is for you. Make sure that by the time the fisherman returns, you are gone. Because just like the days, I burn at both ends. And every time I write, every time I open my eyes, I'm cutting out parts of myself just to give them to you. So shake the dust and take me with you when you do, for none of this has ever been from me. All that pushes and pulls and pushes and pulls, it pushes for you. So grab this world by its clothespins and shake it out again and jump on top and take it for a spin. And when you hop off, shake it again. For this is yours. Make my words worth something. Make this more than just another poem that I write, more than just another night that sits heavy above us all. Walk into it. Breathe it in. Let it crash through the halls of your arms like the millions of years of millions of poets, coursing like blood, pumping and pushing, making you live, shaking the dust. When the world knocks on your front door, clutch the knob tightly and open on up and run forward into its widespread greeting arms, your hands in front of you, fingertips trembling, though they may be.
That poem you just heard was Anis Mojgani's live performance of his piece, Shake the Dust. It's performed at Heavy and Light, which is an amazing event put on by the good folks at To Riot Love on Our Arms. I love that. I actually watch that fairly often, and I'm glad that you all got to hear it. That was such a good conversation. I just love how Anis sees the world. I feel like I learned so much from spending that time with him and getting to have that conversation. I'm so glad we got to share it. More than anyone else I know, Anis models this crazy, beautiful idea that we have a huge capacity for joy alongside our huge capacities for pain. I love that part of our conversation where he said this: I hesitate to seek to find silver linings. What works is to recognize that I have tremendous sadness and anger and grief inside me. But that doesn't mean that I don't have, in the same hand, tremendous joy, a wealth of laughter to engage in so much goodness within me. And all those things can exist. They're all sitting there. Anis gets it. He just gets what it's all about. And I really resonate with this idea and hope that you did too. A piece of advice that Anis has often given to young artists in the past is to observe everything around you and store up its inspirations so that you don't have to wait for inspiration to arrive. It's simply and hopefully always present. You can find Anis Mojgani and more of its inspirational art on Twitter and Instagram, as well as opportunities to purchase his poetry through your local bookstore or on Amazon. His website is thepianofarm.com. If you're new to Sounds Good, we would love for you to stick around. If you enjoyed this conversation with Anis, you'd also love our past episodes with Chantel Martin and Devin Allen, two artists and deep thinkers that I also deeply admire. You can find those episodes and all of our other episodes on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. This podcast is created by me, Branden Harvey, as a part of Good, 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 a community that believes in the power of celebrating good news and becoming good news. You can also get lots more hopeful stories on social media by following us everywhere at Good, Good, Good Co. we also create a beautiful quarterly newspaper that celebrates the people, ideas, and movements that are changing the world for the better. You can and should order it today. Check it out and see what else we do at Good at goodgoodgood.co. And on that note, that is a wrap for this week's episode. It's your turn to go out and do some good this week. And we'll be back next week with another inspiring story from an incredible person leaving an impact on the world. Sound good?